September 19th, 1943. Wilhelmshaven Naval Shipyard, North Sea coast. The steel hull stretched before Kapitän zur. See Hermann Schwarz, like a mathematical impossibility made real, and as his gloved hand touched the cold riveted plates of the captured American Liberty ship, he felt something shift in his understanding of the war. This vessel, christened Stephen Hopkins before its capture, represented something far more terrifying than any battleship. It was the physical proof that Germany had already lost the industrial equation that would determine the outcome of this conflict. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Schwarz had spent 28 years in the Kriegsmarine, rising through the ranks with the precision and dedication that characterized the German Naval Officer Corps. He had studied at the Naval Academy in relation to Staders, Mürwik, served aboard cruisers in the First World War, and helped rebuild Germany's navy in defiance of Versailles. He understood ships the way a master craftsman understands his tools intimately, completely, professionally. But standing in the cold morning air of Wilhelmshaven, examining this captured American merchant vessel, he was looking at something that contradicted every principle of naval construction he had ever learned. The ship before him was built wrong. Everything about it violated German engineering standards. The welding was crude, almost primitive compared to the meticulous riveting preferred by German yards. The steel plates showed variations in thickness that would never pass Kriegsmarine inspection. The machinery spaces were laid out with an almost careless efficiency that prioritized speed of assembly over elegance of design. And yet, despite all these apparent flaws, the ship worked. More than worked, it had crossed the Atlantic multiple times, survived. Storms and submarine attacks carried thousands of tons of cargo and continued operating until its capture off the coast of West Africa in September 1942. The capture itself had been a Kriegsmarine success story. U-boat U-512, commanded by Kapitän Lieutenant Wolfgang Schulze, had intercepted the Stephen Hopkins in the South Atlantic. After a brief engagement with the armed merchant cruiser Stier, the Liberty ship had been overwhelmed. The German prize crew that boarded the vessel found her cargo holds filled with military supplies, trucks, ammunition, aviation fuel, medical supplies, and machinery. Standard American logistical abundance. But it was the ship itself that fascinated German naval intelligence. Orders came directly from the Oberkommando der Marine. Bring the vessel to Wilhelmshaven for detailed examination. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz himself wanted to understand how the Americans were building merchant ships at such an apparently impossible rate. Intelligence reports from German agents in neutral countries suggested the Americans were launching merchant vessels at a pace that defied comprehension, sometimes multiple ships per day. Such claims seemed like obvious Allied propaganda. No nation could build ships that quickly. Naval construction was a painstaking process requiring skilled craftsmen, precision engineering, and months of careful assembly. The Kriegsmarine knew this with certainty. They had built some of the finest warships in the world. The Bismarck, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, each one represented thousands of hours of expert labor, the pinnacle of German engineering excellence. And yet here was this crude American merchant ship, this industrial insult to proper naval architecture, suggesting that perhaps the intelligence reports were not propaganda at all. Schwarz had been appointed to head the technical examination team. Joining him were Fregattenkapitän Ernst Lindemann, a naval architect who had worked on the design of the Admiral Hipper-class cruisers, Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Weber, a machinery specialist who had served as chief engineer aboard the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Hartmann, a young officer with a degree in industrial engineering from the Technical University of Berlin. Together, they represented some of the finest naval technical expertise in Germany. Their mission was straightforward: determine how the Americans were building these ships so quickly, and assess whether Germany could replicate the process. The examination began at 0600 hours on September 20th, 1943. Schwarz gathered his team on the dock beside the captured Liberty ship, now bearing the temporary German designation HKS Transport Versailles. The morning was cold, typical for the North Sea coast in autumn, and a thin drizzle made the steel deck plates slippery. Schwarz addressed his team with characteristic German precision. "Gentlemen, we have been given a unique opportunity. This vessel represents American industrial methodology applied to naval construction. Our task is to understand not merely how this ship was built, but why the Americans chose to build it this way. We must think not as naval officers accustomed to proper construction, but as industrial engineers seeking maximum production efficiency. Set aside your assumptions. Observe, measure, document, and analyze. We begin with the hull structure." They climbed the gangway and began their examination at the bow, working methodically aft. Lindemann, the naval architect, immediately noted the welding. In German shipbuilding tradition, major structural elements were riveted, a time-tested method that required skilled craftsmen but produced reliable, proven results. The Liberty ship was almost entirely welded. "Look at these weld beads," Lindemann said, running his gloved hand along a seam. "Inconsistent penetration, rough finish, minimal grinding. This would never pass inspection at any German yard." Weber knelt beside him, examining the joint with a practiced eye. And yet, the structural integrity appears adequate. These welds have survived Atlantic storms and combat stress. The question is not whether they meet our standards, but whether they meet the ship's operational requirements. It was a subtle but profound distinction. German engineering culture emphasized perfection, every component built to the highest possible standard, every process executed with meticulous care. The American approach visible in this ship's construction suggested a different philosophy. Build to the minimum acceptable standard, but build quickly and in vast quantities. Quality through quantity, rather than perfection through craft. They moved to the cargo holds, massive open spaces designed to swallow trucks, tanks, locomotives, and bulk cargo with equal efficiency. The holds were simple rectangular boxes, no wasted space, no elegant curves, no aesthetic considerations whatsoever. "It is like examining a steel shoebox," Hartmann observed. "Pure functionality, no concessions to traditional ship design at all." Schwarz nodded slowly. "Because traditional ship design assumes each vessel is a unique creation, built by craftsmen who take pride in their work. This ship assumes the opposite, that vessels are industrial products to be manufactured in series, like automobiles or rifles." The machinery spaces revealed more of the American philosophy. The engine was a simple triple-expansion steam engine, a design that dated back to the late 19th century. Not efficient by modern standards, not powerful, not sophisticated, but simple, reliable, and most importantly, easy to manufacture. Weber spent 3 hours examining the engine room, taking measurements, sketching diagrams, consulting technical manuals that had been captured with the ship. When he finally emerged, his face bore an expression of grudging respect. "This engine is obsolete. By 20 years, he reported. Any German yard could build a more efficient power plant, but this engine requires no specialized parts, no precision machining beyond basic industrial capability. The Americans chose this design specifically because it could be manufactured by factories that had never built marine engines before. They sacrificed efficiency for manufacturability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The examination continued for 6 days. The team worked from dawn until well after dark, measuring, photographing, documenting every aspect of the ship's construction. They examined the electrical systems, simple and robust, using standard industrial components rather than specialized marine equipment. They studied the accommodation spaces, Spartan, functional, with no concessions to comfort or tradition. They analyzed the deck, machinery cranes, winches, ventilators, all built to commercial rather than military specifications. Each system revealed the same pattern: simplification, standardization, and focus on rapid production over traditional quality. On the evening of the 6th day, Schwarz called his team together in the small office that had been set up in one of the dockside buildings. Outside, the September rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with steady insistence. Inside, The four officers sat surrounded by hundreds of pages of notes, diagrams, photographs, and technical specifications. "Gentlemen," Schwarz began, "we have completed our physical examination of the vessel. Now we must analyze what we have learned and understand what it means for Germany's strategic position. Lindemann, your assessment of the hull construction?" The naval architect consulted his notes, though Schwarz suspected he had already memorized every detail. The hull structure represents a radical departure from traditional shipbuilding methodology. Extensive use of welding rather than riveting reduces construction time by approximately 40 to 50%, but requires careful quality control to prevent catastrophic failure. The Americans have accepted this risk in exchange for production speed. The hull form is extremely simple, essentially a rectangular box with a pointed bow and flat stern. No compound curves, no complex shapes, no features that require skilled workers or specialized tools. The entire hull could be prefabricated in sections by factories with basic steel fabrication capability, then assembled like a child's building blocks. Most significantly, the design eliminates almost all customization. Every Liberty ship is identical. This is not traditional shipbuilding where each vessel is unique. This is industrial mass production applied to ships. Weber added his observations on the machinery. The propulsion system confirms the same philosophy. The triple expansion engine is deliberately archaic, chosen specifically because it requires no advanced manufacturing capability. The boilers are equally simple, basic fire tube design that any industrial boiler manufacturer could produce. The Americans have essentially used locomotive technology for their marine power plant. The result is a ship that any industrialized nation could build, not just specialized naval yards. They have democratized ship construction, removed it from the realm of specialized craftsmen, and made it accessible to general industrial capacity. Hartmann, the youngest member of the team, contributed the most disturbing analysis. "I have been calculating production requirements based on what we have observed. If we assume that the Americans have standardized not just the ship design, but also the construction process itself, then they could theoretically build these vessels using assembly line methodology similar to automobile production. Traditional shipbuilding requires approximately 9 to 12 months per vessel. But if the Americans have truly industrialized the process, prefabricating major sections and assembling them rapidly, they could potentially reduce construction time to weeks rather than months." Schwarz had already reached the same conclusion, but hearing it stated aloud by a bright young officer with training in industrial engineering gave it additional weight. "Our intelligence reports suggest the Americans are launching Liberty ships at a rate of 3 per day, he said quietly. "When I first heard this number, I assumed it was propaganda or a misunderstanding. But based on what we have learned from examining this vessel, I now believe it may actually be conservative." The silence in the room was profound. 3 ships per day, 90 ships per month, over 1,000 ships per year. The numbers were simply staggering. The Kriegsmarine, with all of Germany's industrial capacity and technical expertise, could not build merchant vessels at even a fraction of that rate. The German shipbuilding industry was producing perhaps 20 to 30 merchant ships per year, and those required mobilization of the nation's best shipyards and most skilled workers. "We must verify these numbers," Lindemann said. "Perhaps the Americans are launching 3 ships per day across all their shipyards combined. That would still be impressive, but at least comprehensible." Schwarz shook his head. "I have requested additional intelligence from the Abwehr. The reports are consistent and come from multiple independent sources, including neutral Swedish and Spanish observers. The Americans have built over a dozen specialized shipyards, specifically for Liberty ship production. The largest, in California, employs over 90,000 workers and operates 24 hours per day in 3 shifts. They are not building ships. Gentlemen, they are manufacturing them." He paused, letting the distinction sink in. "And this has profound strategic implications that we must include in our report to the Oberkommando der Marine." Weber understood immediately. If the Americans can build merchant ships faster than our U-boats can sink them, then the Battle of the Atlantic is already lost. It becomes a mathematical impossibility. We would need to sink ships faster than they can be replaced, but if they are building 3 per day, that is over 1,000 ships per year. The entire U-boat fleet would need to sink 3 ships every single day just to maintain equilibrium, and more than that to reduce their merchant fleet. It cannot be done. The implications cascaded through Schwarz's mind like tumbling dominoes. The U-boat campaign had been Germany's best hope for strangling Britain's supply lines and preventing American military buildup in Britain. But if the Americans could replace their merchant losses faster than Germany could inflict them, then the entire strategic calculus collapsed. The Kriegsmarine was fighting against an industrial system that treated ships as expendable resources rather than precious assets. "There is more," Hartmann added, consulting his calculations. "These Liberty ships have a cargo capacity of approximately 10,000 tons each. If the Americans are producing 1,000 ships per year, that represents 10 million tons of new cargo capacity annually. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire merchant marine at the start of the war was approximately 4.5 million tons. The Americans are adding more than twice Germany's total merchant fleet capacity every single year." Lindemann lit a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. "We are not fighting a nation. We are fighting an industrial civilization that has decided to apply its full capacity to war production. And that civilization has resources we cannot match." Schwarz stood and walked to the window, looking out at the captured Liberty ship illuminated by worklights in the rainy darkness. The vessel sat low in the water, ungainly and ungraceful, an insult to every principle of fine shipbuilding he had learned over 3 decades of naval service. And yet, that ugly, crude, mass-produced ship represented something far more powerful than the most beautiful warship ever built. It represented industrial capacity deployed at scale, efficiency chosen over elegance, quantity embraced as its own form of quality. The German naval tradition emphasized craftsmanship, quality, and excellence. Each ship was a masterwork, built by skilled workers who took pride in their creation. The Bismarck had been a floating testament to German engineering superiority. But the Bismarck was gone, sunk in the North Atlantic after a single operation, taking with her over 2,000 trained sailors and representing years of irreplaceable construction effort. This Liberty ship, built in perhaps 6 weeks by semi-skilled workers in a factory that had never built ships before, could be replaced almost immediately if lost. And the Americans were building them by the thousands. "Our report must be honest," Schwarz said finally, still looking out at the ship. "We must tell the Oberkommando der Marine what we have learned, even though they will not want to hear it. The Americans have not simply built a ship, they have built a system, a production system, that can generate merchant vessels faster than we can destroy them. They have solved the fundamental problem of naval warfare in a way we never anticipated. They have made ships expendable." He turned back to face his team. "We will document everything, every measurement, every observation, every calculation. We will provide the Oberkommando with a complete technical analysis of this vessel and a strategic assessment of what it means for Germany's position. We will be thorough, accurate, and professionally honest. That is our duty as officers." The team worked through the night, compiling their findings into a comprehensive report. The document eventually ran to over 200 pages, filled with technical diagrams, photographs, calculations, and strategic analysis. The conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The United States had developed industrial shipbuilding capacity that Germany could not match, counter, or compete with. The Liberty ship program represented a fundamental transformation in naval warfare, where industrial production capacity had become the decisive factor rather than traditional naval excellence. The report reached Berlin on October 8, 1943, delivered by courier to the Oberkommando der Marine headquarters on Tirpitzufer. Großadmiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine since January 30, 1943, received the document in his office overlooking the Landwehr Canal. He read it in silence over the course of 3 hours, his expression growing progressively darker as he turned each page. When he finished, he summoned his Chief of Staff, Vice-Admiral Eberhard Gott, and his Chief of Operations, Konter-Admiral Gerhard Wagner. The 3 men sat in Dönitz's office as autumn sunlight slanted through the windows, and for several minutes no one spoke. Finally, Dönitz placed the report on his desk with careful precision, as though the document itself might detonate. "Is Kapitän See Schwarz reliable?" he asked. "Does he have a history of defeatist thinking or excessive pessimism?" Gott shook his head. "Schwarz is one of our finest technical officers. He served with distinction in the First World War, received the Iron Cross First Class, and has been involved in every major naval construction project since 1933. His assessments are typically conservative, if anything. If Schwarz says the Americans are building 3 Liberty ships per day, then they are building 3 Liberty ships per day." Wagner added, "I have cross-referenced his findings with intelligence from other sources. The Swedish military attaché in Washington confirms that American Taves shipyards are producing merchant vessels at extraordinary rates. The British themselves acknowledge in their own internal communications, which we have intercepted, that American ship production has exceeded their most optimistic predictions. The numbers in Schwarz's report appear to be accurate." Dönitz stood and walked to the large map of the Atlantic that dominated one wall of his office. Coloured pins marked the positions of U-boat wolf packs, convoy routes, and recent engagements. For 2 years, he had orchestrated the Battle of the Atlantic with the precision of a chess master, positioning his submarines to inflict maximum damage on Allied shipping. The statistics had been encouraging. In 1942 alone, U-boats had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied merchant shipping. But if the Americans were adding 10 million tons of new shipping capacity every year, then those losses were not just sustainable, they were irrelevant. "Gentlemen," Dönitz said slowly, "we are facing a strategic impossibility. Our entire U-boat campaign is predicated on the assumption that we can sink merchant ships faster than the Allies can replace them. If we maintain sufficient pressure, we can starve Britain into submission and prevent American military build-up in Europe. But these numbers suggest we are not even reducing their total merchant fleet. We are merely forcing them to build replacements, which they do with apparent ease." Wagner consulted his own notes. "Our current operational U-boat strength is approximately 240 submarines. On average, each operational boat sinks approximately 1.5 ships per month while on patrol. That gives us a theoretical maximum sinking capacity of perhaps 360 ships per month, or roughly 4,000 ships per year. But the Americans alone are building over 1,000 Liberty ships annually, and that does not include British, Canadian, or other Allied construction. We are not keeping pace. We are falling further behind with each passing month." The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Germany was losing the Battle of the Atlantic not through tactical failure but through strategic impossibility. The U-boat force was fighting courageously and effectively, but courage and effectiveness meant nothing against an enemy who could absorb losses and continue expanding their capabilities. Gott raised another concern. There is also the question of crew quality and construction capacity. Each U-boat we lose takes with it 40 to 50 highly trained submariners, men who require years to replace. Each U-boat we build requires specialized facilities, precision manufacturing, and months of construction time. We cannot expand our submarine fleet rapidly enough to match the expansion of the Allied merchant fleet. We are trapped in an equation we cannot solve." Dönitz returned to his desk and sat down heavily. He had built the U-boat force from almost nothing after the Purge. Restrictions of Versailles were finally lifted. He had developed the Wolfpack tactics that had proven so effective in the early war years. He had personally known many of the U-boat commanders who now rested in cold Atlantic graves, and now he was being told that all of it, the courage, the sacrifice, the tactical brilliance, was meaningless against American industrial capacity. "What does Schwarz recommend?" he asked. Wagner flipped to the final section of the report. "He suggests that Germany cannot win a war of industrial attrition against the United States. He recommends that the Kriegsmarine focus on quality over quantity, developing advanced submarine types that are faster, quieter, and more difficult to detect. He specifically mentions the Type 21 electric submarine currently under development. He argues that technological superiority is our only possible advantage against numerical superiority." It was sound advice, But Dönitz knew the timeline did not favor Klar, Germany. The Type 21 submarines were still in development, and mass production would not begin until 1944 at the earliest. In the meantime, the Americans would continue building their Liberty ships, expanding their merchant fleet, and gradually overwhelming Germany's ability to interdict Atlantic supply lines. The war was becoming a race between German technological innovation and American industrial production, and production was winning. There is something else in the report, Gott said carefully. Schwarz includes a section on strategic implications beyond the naval war. He argues that the Liberty ship program reveals the scale of American industrial mobilization. If they can build ships at this rate, they can presumably build aircraft, tanks, trucks, and weapons at similar rates. He suggests that American material superiority will eventually become overwhelming across all domains of warfare. Dönitz had already reached the same conclusion while reading the report, but having it stated explicitly made the reality unavoidable. Germany was not just losing the Battle of the Atlantic, Germany was losing the industrial war that would determine the outcome of the entire conflict. The nation that could build 3 ships per day could build hundreds of aircraft per week, thousands of tanks per month, and supply its armies with seemingly unlimited ammunition, fuel, and equipment. The German military, for all its tactical excellence and combat experience, would eventually be buried under an avalanche of American production. "We will forward this report to the Führer," Dönitz said finally. "He must understand the strategic situation we face. Perhaps this will convince him to seek a political solution before our position becomes completely untenable." But even as he spoke, Dönitz knew that Hitler would reject any such analysis. The Führer had built his entire ideology on the premise of German superiority and Allied weakness. He would not accept evidence that contradicted his worldview, regardless of how thoroughly documented that evidence might be. The report did reach Hitler, delivered through official channels to the Reich Chancellery. Hitler's response came back within 48 hours. The analysis was defeatist, the numbers were Allied propaganda, and the officers involved should focus on fighting rather than creating excuses for failure. Schwarz was not punished, but he was quietly reassigned to less sensitive duties, his expertise deemed contaminated by excessive honesty. Yet the truth documented in Schwarz's report continued spreading through the German Naval Officer Corps. Copies of the document circulated quietly among senior commanders, each reading generating the same shocked realization. Young officers in particular were affected, those who had grown up under Nazi propaganda about German superiority and American decadence. The Liberty ship examination had pulled back the curtain on comfortable myths and revealed uncomfortable mathematics. Fregattenkapitän Ernst Lindemann, the naval architect who had examined the Liberty ship's hull structure, found himself unable to stop thinking about what he had learned. In the weeks following the examination, he began researching American industrial capacity more broadly, requesting intelligence reports, studying captured documents, and analyzing every piece of information he could acquire about American war production. What he discovered exceeded even his pessimistic expectations. The United States had transformed itself into what Lindemann began calling an industrial war machine, operating at a scale that defied European comprehension. American aircraft production had reached 8,000 planes per month by mid-1943. American tank production exceeded 3,000 per month. American truck production, military trucks alone, was running at 50,000 per month. The numbers seemed fictional, the product of propaganda or statistical manipulation. But multiple independent sources confirmed the same general magnitude. America was producing war material at rates that made German production look almost quaint by comparison. Lindemann compiled his research into a private memorandum that he shared only with trusted colleagues. In it, he argued that Germany's strategic error had been fundamental. German military planning had assumed that war was primarily a contest of military skill, tactical excellence, and fighting spirit. The Americans had approached war as an industrial problem to be solved through engineering, production efficiency, and logistical organization. Both approaches worked, but industrial capacity proved more decisive than military tradition. "We built the finest warships in the world," Lindemann wrote, "but they built more ships than we could sink. We trained the finest soldiers in the world, but they trained adequate soldiers faster than we could kill them. We developed superior weapons, but they developed adequate weapons that could be mass-produced. We chose quality, they chose quantity, and in total war, quantity is its own quality. The memorandum circulated through the Naval Officer Corps in handwritten copies, each reader making notes and adding observations. It became an unofficial primer on the new reality of industrial warfare, a reality that contradicted everything these officers had been taught at military academies, where Clausewitz and Moltke were still the primary authorities. The old masters had written about warfare between relatively equal industrial powers where skill and strategy made the difference. None had addressed what happened when one side possessed overwhelming industrial superiority. That was the situation Germany now faced, and traditional military doctrine offered no solutions. Kapitän Friedrich Weber, the machinery specialist from the Liberty ship examination team, experienced his own crisis of understanding. He had spent his career mastering the complex engineering systems that powered German warships, sophisticated turbines, advanced diesel engines, intricate reduction gears. He had taken pride in German engineering excellence, the precision and craftsmanship that made German machinery the finest in the world. The Liberty ship's crude, simple engine had offended his professional sensibilities, but as he reflected on what that simplicity meant strategically, his perspective shifted. German engineering excellence required highly skilled workers, specialized facilities, and extended construction time. It was not scalable. The German military could build a limited number of excellent ships, planes, and tanks, but could not expand production rapidly enough to replace losses or match enemy expansion. The Americans had sacrificed engineering excellence for production efficiency, and in doing so had solved the fundamental problem of industrial warfare. How to generate military capability faster than the enemy could destroy it. Weber began studying American production methodology more broadly, and what he learned transformed his understanding of modern war. The Americans had applied assembly line techniques, developed by Henry Ford for automobile production, to virtually everything they manufactured. Ships were built in sections and assembled like automobiles. Aircraft were produced on moving assembly lines with interchangeable parts. Tanks rolled off production lines with the same efficiency as commercial vehicles. The American approach eliminated craftsmanship in favor of standardization, rejected customization in favor of mass production, and replaced skilled workers with semi-skilled workers following standardized procedures. The result was a production system that could be scaled almost infinitely, limited only by raw materials and available labor, rather than by skilled craftsmen or specialized facilities. Weber compiled his analysis into a technical report focused specifically on production methodology. His conclusion was stark. Germany could not compete with American industrial efficiency using traditional European manufacturing approaches. The entire German industrial system was built around small-scale production of high-quality goods by skilled craftsmen. This model worked brilliantly for peacetime manufacturing but proved catastrophically inadequate for total war. To match American production capacity, Germany would need to completely restructure its industrial base, train workers in mass production techniques, standardize designs across all military equipment, and sacrifice the quality that German engineers prized above all else. Such a transformation would take years, require enormous capital investment, and face cultural resistance from workers and engineers who took pride in traditional craftsmanship. In other words, it was impossible. Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Hartmann, the youngest member of the examination team, drew perhaps the most disturbing conclusions from the Liberty ship analysis. His training in industrial engineering had given him tools for understanding production systems that his older colleagues lacked. He recognized that the Liberty ship was not just a vessel but a component in a larger logistical system, a system designed to move material from American factories to European battlefields with maximum efficiency. Hartmann began mapping this logistical system, tracking how raw materials became finished goods, how those goods were transported to ports, loaded onto ships, conveyed across the Atlantic, and delivered to military forces. What emerged from his analysis was a picture of systematic, methodical, almost mechanical efficiency. The Americans had essentially created an industrial pipeline connecting their factories to the front lines, and that pipeline was expanding continuously. Every Liberty ship increased the pipeline's capacity, every new shipyard expanded production, every improvement in convoy tactics reduced losses. The system was self-reinforcing and apparently unstoppable. In February 1944, Hartmann was invited to present his analysis to a gathering of junior naval officers at the Naval Academy in Flensburg. He stood before 30 young officers, most fresh from training and eager to prove themselves in combat, and told them truths that no one wanted to hear. "Gentlemen," he began, "you have been trained to fight with courage, skill, and determination. Those qualities remain essential, but you must also understand the nature of the war we are fighting. This is not a contest of martial valor. It is a competition of industrial systems. The side that can produce more ships, more planes, more tanks, more ammunition, and deliver them to the battlefield more efficiently will win. Everything else, tactics, strategy, leadership, courage, matters only at the margins." He used the Liberty ship as his central example, explaining how its crude design enabled rapid production, how its standardization allowed unskilled workers to build it, how its simplicity reduced maintenance requirements, and how its production rate exceeded German sinking capacity. "The Americans are not building better ships than us," he explained. "They are building adequate ships faster than we can sink them, and that difference is decisive. In war, adequate equipment delivered in overwhelming quantity defeats excellent equipment delivered in limited quantity. This is the fundamental lesson of industrial warfare." The young officers listened with visible discomfort. Some challenged his conclusions, arguing that German tactical superiority could overcome material disadvantages. Hartmann did not argue back. Instead, he presented statistics. He showed production comparisons across every category of military equipment. He demonstrated mathematically that Germany could not inflict losses on Allied forces faster than those forces could be replaced and expanded. He proved, using simple arithmetic, that Germany was losing the war of production and that tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic material inferiority. The presentation ended in uncomfortable silence. Several officers left angry, convinced that Hartmann was spreading defeatism, but others stayed to ask questions, to examine his data, to understand the implications of what he had shown them. These were the officers who would survive the war, who would carry forward the lessons learned, who would help build a new Germany that understood the realities of modern industrial warfare. By spring 1944, the Liberty ship examination had become something of a legend within the German Naval Officer Corps. Officers who had never seen the captured vessel still spoke about it, using it as shorthand for American industrial capacity. Another Liberty ship situation became code for any instance where German quality met American quantity. The phrase carried an undertone of grim, resignation acknowledgement that Germany was fighting a type of war for which it was fundamentally unprepared. The actual Liberty ship examined by Schwarz and his team remained at Wilhelmshaven through early 1944, used occasionally for training purposes and technical demonstrations. But its real impact was psychological rather than practical. It had become a symbol, a physical representation of the industrial gulf between Germany and America. Officers who visited it came away shaken, their confidence in German victory eroded by direct confrontation with American production efficiency. In March 1944, British bombers struck Wilhelmshaven in a major raid targeting the naval base and shipyards. The Liberty ship, still docked where Schwarz had examined it 6 months earlier, was hit by several bombs and burned. German firefighters made no serious effort to save it. The ship sank at its moorings, settling into the shallow harbour water until only its superstructure remained visible. No one ordered it raised or repaired. Perhaps because by then, everyone understood that one Liberty ship, more or less, made no difference. The Americans had hundreds more, with hundreds more under construction, and the industrial machine that produced them was still accelerating. The examination was complete. The lesson had been learned. Germany had looked directly at American industrial might made physical, and German officers had understood with terrible clarity that they were fighting an unwinnable war of production. The The psychological impact of the Liberty ship examination rippled through German military thinking far beyond the naval officer corps. By summer 1944, copies of the technical reports and strategic analyses had reached the Wehrmacht High Command, Luftwaffe headquarters, and even elements of the SS leadership. Each service branch recognized variations of the same problem in their own domain. The Luftwaffe faced Allied aircraft production that exceeded German capacity by ratios of 5-to-1 or greater. The Wehrmacht confronted American armored divisions equipped with such abundant vehicles that German officers initially mistook supply columns for combat formations. Everywhere German forces encountered American units, they found themselves facing not just soldiers but logistical systems of staggering capability. General der Panzertruppen, Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as chief of staff to several armoured formations on both the eastern and western fronts, later wrote extensively about the shock of encountering American material abundance. His memoirs, published after the war, devoted significant attention to what he called the Liberty ship moment, the instant when German officers realized they were not fighting an army but an industrial empire. Von Mellenthin described his own such moment in August 1944, shortly after the Allied breakout from Normandy. His unit had been conducting a fighting retreat through France, attempting to delay American advances while German forces established new defensive lines. During a brief pause in a small French village, von Mellenthin observed an American supply convoy passing through. "I stood by the roadside for 3 hours," he wrote, "and in that time, over 1,200 vehicles passed. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, tankers, all moving in perfect order, each driver maintaining precise spacing, the entire column coordinated with mechanical efficiency. What struck me most was not the number of vehicles, though that was impressive enough, but the fact that they were all new, freshly painted, mechanically sound, obviously just delivered from American factories. We were struggling to keep our remaining vehicles operational with scavenged parts and improvised repairs, while the Americans were receiving new equipment faster than they could wear out the old." He continued, "I thought of the Liberty ship reports I had read, and suddenly understood that we were seeing the same principle applied to land warfare. The Americans had not come to Europe with an army, in the traditional sense. They had come with an industrial system that generated military capability continuously, replacing losses automatically, expanding capacity systematically. We were fighting a machine that could not be stopped because destroying individual components did not damage the system itself. Cut off one supply line, and 3 more appeared. Destroy one tank company and 2 more arrived the next week. It was like fighting the ocean. You might win individual battles against particular waves, but the tide itself was unstoppable." The Wehrmacht intelligence services, which had initially dismissed the Liberty ship reports as naval pessimism, began conducting their own analyses of American production capacity. What they discovered confirmed and expanded the naval findings. American truck production alone exceeded total German vehicle production across all categories. A single American factory, the Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours per day. The Chrysler tank arsenal was delivering Sherman tanks at a rate of 1 every 45 minutes during peak production. Major Reinhard Gehlen, who headed Wehrmacht intelligence operations on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, compiled what became known as the Gehlen Report in September 1944. This classified document, distributed only to the highest levels of military command, provided a comprehensive analysis of Allied industrial capacity and its implications for Germany's strategic position. The report's conclusion was unambiguous. Germany could not achieve military victory against opponents who possessed such overwhelming material superiority. The best German forces could hope for was to inflict sufficient casualties and delay Allied advances long enough for Imsters, political considerations to create possibilities for negotiated settlement. Even this limited goal required that German forces remain cohesive and effective, something that material shortages were making increasingly difficult. Gehlen's report included specific comparisons drawn from the Liberty ship examination. He noted that the American approach to warfare standardization, mass production, logistical efficiency, and acceptance of adequate rather than perfect equipment had proven superior to German emphasis on quality and tactical excellence. "We trained our soldiers to be warriors," Galen wrote. "They trained their soldiers to be workers. We built weapons as craftsmen. They built weapons as factory managers. In a short war, our approach would have advantages. In a long war of attrition, their approach is unbeatable." The report generated controversy within the German High Command. Older officers, trained in the traditions of Prussian military excellence, rejected the notion that quality could be defeated by quantity. They pointed to German tactical victories, to the superior kill ratios German forces maintained even in defeat, to the demonstrated excellence of German weapons and training. But younger officers, those who had actually fought against American forces and witnessed their material abundance firsthand, understood that Galen was right. The war had become an industrial equation, and Germany's answer was insufficient. Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded armoured reconnaissance forces in Normandy and later in the Battle of the Bulge, experienced his own crisis of understanding when his unit captured an American supply depot in December 1944 during the Ardennes offensive. The depot contained more supplies than von Luck's entire division had received in the previous 6 months. "We found warehouses filled with food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, clothing, everything a military force might need," von Luck later recalled. The quantities were staggering. "My men, who had been living on reduced rations and operating vehicles with worn-out parts, simply could not comprehend such abundance. We spent an entire day just inventorying what we had captured, and still had not counted everything." What struck me most was the waste. The Americans discarded equipment we would have repaired and reused. They threw away clothing we would have patched and worn for years. They abandoned vehicles with minor mechanical problems rather than attempting repairs. At first, I thought this reflected poor discipline or lack of military spirit. Then I understood they could afford to be wasteful because replacement supplies were always available. For them, time spent repairing old equipment was less efficient than simply requisitioning new equipment. They had solved the logistical problem so thoroughly that conservation was unnecessary. Von Luck's unit enjoyed its captured bounty for exactly 3 days before American forces counterattacked and retook the depot. As von Luck retreated, he watched American trucks already arriving with fresh supplies to replace what had been captured. The cycle continued, inexorable and impersonal. The Americans lost supplies, requisitioned replacements, received new material, and continued operations with barely a pause. For German forces, the loss of such a depot would have been catastrophic. For the Americans, it was a minor logistical adjustment. The final months of the war brought home the Liberty ship lesson with brutal clarity to every German soldier who faced Western Allied forces. American artillery fired so many shells that German troops learned to recognize the sound of different American guns by the frequency of their fire. American aircraft appeared over battlefields in such numbers that German soldiers stopped taking cover and simply accepted that air attacks were a constant environmental condition like weather. American tanks advanced in such quantities that destroying individual vehicles accomplished nothing more always appeared, often within hours. By spring 1945, German military resistance in the West had collapsed not through lack of courage or fighting spirit, but through simple material exhaustion. Units ran out of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. Soldiers surrendered not because they had lost the will to fight, but because they literally had nothing to fight with. The industrial machine they had been fighting for 4 years had finally ground them into irrelevance. Kapitän See Hermann Schwarz, who had examined the Liberty ship 18 months earlier, spent the final weeks of the war at his home in Hamburg, relieved of duty due to age and health concerns. He watched British forces enter the city in early May 1945 without resistance. German defenders had simply dissolved, lacking the means to fight even if they retained the will. On May 8, 1945, Schwarz listened to the announcement of Germany's unconditional surrender on a neighbour's radio. He thought about the Liberty ship, about standing on its crude, welded deck in September 1943, about the moment he had understood that Germany was going to lose the war. He had been right, but being right brought no satisfaction. Understanding defeat did not prevent it. The German officers who survived the war carried forward the lessons learned from confronting American industrial capacity. These lessons shaped post-war German military thinking, influenced European economic integration, and contributed to fundamental changes in how modern militaries understood the relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness. Ernst Lindemann, the naval architect from the examination team, survived the war and worked during the 1950s as a consultant to the new West German Navy. He spent considerable effort studying NATO logistics and American military organization, trying to understand how the Western alliance could maintain forces in Europe indefinitely through sheer industrial capacity. His post-war writings emphasized that military strength in the modern age derived more from industrial organization than from traditional military virtues. The Liberty ship was not a weapon, Lindemann wrote in 1958. It was a symbol of something more powerful than weapons, systematic industrial efficiency applied to military purpose. We learned too late that modern war is won in factories as much as on battlefields, that logistical systems determine strategic possibilities, and that the nation which can produce adequate equipment in overwhelming quantity will defeat the nation that produces excellent equipment in limited quantity. Friedrich Weber, the machinery specialist, emigrated to the United States in 1952 and worked as an engineer for General Motors. He spent years studying American mass production techniques, trying to understand how American industry achieved such remarkable output. His conclusion was that American industrial success derived from cultural factors as much as technical capabilities. American society valued efficiency over tradition, embraced standardization over customization, and rewarded innovation in production methods. These cultural attitudes translated into industrial practices that maximized output while minimizing complexity. Germans built things to last forever, Weber reflected in a 1963 interview. Americans built things to be replaced. In peacetime, our approach produced better products. In wartime, their approach produced victory. Klaus Hartmann, the youngest member of the examination team, had the longest post-war career of any of the officers involved. He taught industrial engineering at the Technical University of Munich from 1951 until his retirement in 1978. His courses emphasized production efficiency, logistical systems, the integration of industrial capacity with strategic planning. He never forgot the Liberty ship examination and used it regularly as a case study in his classes. That ship was ugly, Hartmann would tell his students. It violated every principle of good design. Its welds were crude, its lines were clumsy, its machinery was obsolete. But it worked, and more importantly, thousands like it could be built quickly by relatively unskilled workers. That ship taught us that in modern industrial competition, whether in war or peace, the winner is not who builds the best product, but who builds adequate products most efficiently. Excellence is meaningless if you cannot scale it. Adequacy, combined with mass production, defeats excellence, combined with limited production. This is the fundamental lesson of industrial modernity. The Liberty ship itself, the specific vessel examined at Wilhelmshaven, never sailed again after sinking in the March 1944 bombing raid. It was eventually raised in the 1950s and scrapped, its steel recycled into post-war reconstruction. By then, the American Liberty ship program had long since ended, its mission complete. Over 2,700 Liberty ships had been built during the war. 18 were built in a single day, November 12, 1942, setting a record that still stands as perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of American industrial capacity ever recorded. The German naval officers who examined one captured Liberty ship in September 1943 could not have known the program's final statistics. They did not know that the fastest Liberty ship, Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. They did not know that Liberty ships would carry 75% of all cargo shipped overseas during the war. They did not know that these crude, simple, mass-produced vessels would help win the war and then continue serving for decades, afterward in commercial service. But they knew enough. They understood, through careful examination of one single vessel, that America had transformed warfare itself. The traditional elements of military success tactics, strategy, leadership, fighting spirit remained important, but had become secondary to industrial capacity. The nation that could build faster, produce more, and sustain logistics on continental scale would win wars regardless of tactical skill or individual valor. This was the lesson written in steel on the deck of the Liberty ship, the lesson German officers learned too late to change the outcome. For the German military tradition, which had valued quality, excellence, and professional expertise above all else, this lesson was devastating. It invalidated centuries of military philosophy built on the premise that superior forces, better led and better equipped, would prevail over inferior ones. The Liberty ship proved that inferior equipment, produced in sufficient quantity and supported by adequate logistics, could defeat superior equipment that could not be replaced or sustained. This was modern industrial warfare in its purest form, not a contest of armies, but a competition of economic systems, not a test of courage, but a measurement of production capacity, not a battle of weapons, but a war of factories. The German officers who studied that captured Liberty ship understood all this, documented it carefully, reported it honestly, and watched helplessly as their understanding changed nothing, because the industrial equation could not be altered through knowledge alone. They had seen the future of warfare, and it was a cargo ship built in 6 weeks by semi-skilled workers in a factory that had never built ships before. It was ugly, crude, and simple, and it was unstoppable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.